Hello, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us on the Muslim Youth Matters podcast, where we are trying to understand some of the challenges and the issues facing the youth of the Muslim community by meeting with various experts and voices from the community itself. On today's episode, we're going to try to dig a little bit deeper to try to understand the political and policy context in which this entire series was actually created, part of a larger project. So, with us, we have a policy expert and someone who has been involved in the youth of the community for many years. So, I think it's very interesting to talk to someone who knows these types of issues from both sides of the coin. Dani Khanafer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And definitely, I think that's a key episode, I would say, or a very important episode in terms of putting that framework around this, right? So, I mean, historically, I always like to give a little background of how CAMYI came to be, the idea behind sort of CAMYI, and how it kind of evolved through since 2018, I would, if I recall. So back then in 2018, we got together with a bunch of establishments all around Quebec, Ontario, about 25 of them, or somewhere in that range. And I think the idea was that, okay, we're facing a number of issues with our youth, right? You don't need an expert to realize this. These people are already experts in their own communities. They've lived with them, they eat with them, as they say, and they bake bread. So they know what the issues are, right? They know what these youth are facing. They know that they're facing challenges and barriers at every level. And they know they're also not connecting. There's a lot of linguistic barriers, cultural barriers, right? New age barriers, as they say, right? So when we got together, it was under the idea that, there is a government funding right out there. Government does support this type of work. But what do we do, right? What do we do with these 25 organizations? And these were all different levels, right? So some of these organizations were more on the political, some of them were more on the social, some of them were more not religious, right? They're just an establishment of sorts that works in the community, right? So you're already having this variety of levels and engagement at all different levels. And the question is that became kind of obvious. What do we do now, right? We know there's this community resilience fund that's out there that's given by Canada or Public Safety Canada. And how do we integrate and how do we kind of shape this up? Because this has to kind of start from scratch, right? You're going to have to write out sort of your rationale, your proposal, and what you actually intend to do. So I think we kind of landed on something, and we said, hold on, we're all at different levels. We are speaking the same language, English, but we don't seem to connect on some of these words. And a healthy discussion, right, in its rights. Much needed discussion, and a discussion that that bore some fruit, right? So we said, hold on, why don't we get together and let's do a bit of conferences? Bring the experts, right? Bring those who have a lens that have been dealing with youth over time, and that can kind of flesh it out more succinctly, right? They can give us kind of these terms that maybe we're missing, or the kind of the idea behind it of what's kind of happening with our youth, right? So the issue is cross-cutting. That's something that we agree to. That's not linked to one organization or another. This is linked across pan-Canada for sure. So, as the discussion went on, and then we were hit with a pandemic, right? So we can't really meet face to face, and we still thought that the knowledge component is important, and the knowledge component can be delivered in any way, and thus sort of the podcast that we have here. But that knowledge component is really supposed to feed into a second phase and a third phase. So that programming component, right? So how do you put this into practice? This is the kind of the theory, this is kind of the experience, and are we able to take this theory and pull on that experience and kind of translate into something practical at the community level with youth? So that's been kind of the overall sort of rationale behind this program, and it's a much needed one, right? I mean, these youth are facing challenges from all over, right? So this is kind of this is kind of what's been happening for that past about year and a half to 2 years. Now, more to that, what we noticed is that, at least from my experience, right? So I'm talking typically from, I've been residing in Ottawa for the past 20 years. I've been working with a lot of these community centers across Ottawa for exactly that much time. And a lot of the connections that we made in the networks have been through university, right? So we made a lot of networks and connection through university. And thus, for example, I've known you since that time. I've known you for a long time, Saeed. So, and I've known a lot of these people in the community for a long, long time. But with Do Right, our thinking has evolved, right? I think we started off very, in our youth, right?
Mhm.
Literally in our youth, right? Nothing more than that.
Mhm.
But we started somewhere. We were thrown in, by accident in design, by somebody pushing you in, by your friends kind of pulling you, let's say, let's go do this event or let's go help out, right? So there was a good desire, there's a good intention there. And I think as that has gone through, what I've noticed in the community for the past 20 years, it's been very religious centric, which is fine. And that's because the communities they lean towards religion, they're attached to religion.
Mhm.
And as immigrants, we are attached to that, right? And that's fine. But what's been kind of missing, at least from my understanding, is really that community look, right? That community center. And part of it for me, if you're having that discussion always from a religious lens, you miss out on a lot of other lenses that are out there, right? And part of that knowledge component is to say, okay, I like the religious lens. I want to listen to that as well. But I also want to listen to a lot of these experts that are out there, right? I want to see what their take on this, what they think on that same issues. Do they approach it differently, right? It's like when you go to the doctor and he tells you, hey, you need to lose a few pounds or something like that. And you're like, is that, is running 10 hours a day is the only thing that will make me lose? And the doctor might tell you, hey, there's a bunch of things, right? And, let's bring in the nutritionist, right? Let's bring sort of the, psychologist in order to help you maybe sleep pattern and so on, or to help you accommodate. Let's bring in the occupational stuff. Maybe that's also what's bothering you, right? So you actually look in the reality of things, you never take one person and you say, I will abide by his tenets and his dogmatic sort of lens. But what you do is you end up consulting with a lot of people. And we do that naturally, right? You talk to your mother, your father, your siblings. So why is it that when we come to a community level, we only seem to take from one source? Typically, from my experience, it's just the one source, right? And he's got weight and he's got a lot of influence and he's got a lot of knowledge as well. But it shouldn't be the only source of knowledge from my end. It should be kind of that variety of knowledge, right?
So you said there was a meeting with various organizations, and clearly there are issues that need to be addressed and looked at. What would you say those issues that really surfaced and that we're really trying to look at in this project? What are we looking at? What are these big things that are urgent and absolutely need addressing?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we sat there and we discussed of what these themes should be. What are we actually dealing with here? What's the monster that we need to kind of address? What's the elephant in the room, perhaps? That was even mentioned in one of the meetings. Somebody said we should address the elephants in the room, not elephants,
Yeah.
right? I think a lot of it came down to a discussion around a lot of themes. What does integration mean? What does assimilation mean? What does identity mean? What does media mean? And what's the impact, right? Language barriers and so on, psychological issues. And then you come to realize, as you're sitting there, that, community resilience and promoting promoting that community identity, if you want, at a larger pan-Canadian level is no different from any other community out there. I mean, they're speaking to the same issues that if you were to turn on your television or today your social media account, you'd be hearing the same thing all over, right? Just with different kind of backgrounds, perhaps different countries, but they're dealing with the same issues, right? Because social media is a beast it's not a beast, it's an octopus that reaches far and wide, right? So that's something I think we saw early on, and we thought, okay, we can address these issues, right? We can go back and consult, and that's what we actually did after that meeting. We went into a formal consultation where we picked on about 35 establishments and experts around Canada, and we said, okay, what do you want to see from this? We got the money, we're good in that respect, but what does it exactly mean, identity? What does it exactly mean when we say media? What do these actually mean to you guys? And so we had a very fruitful discussion around there of people kind of just laying it out bare, this is what it actually means. This is what barriers for me as a woman who has a hijab, who's lives in Western or Eastern Canada or Central Canada. This is what it actually means. These are the barriers that I face. This is what it actually means for community barriers for me. This is what I face on a daily. So we kind of took that back and we kind of worked it and said, okay, let's now kind of sift this through and identify these key themes, and we identified them. So, and these podcasts that our listeners will listen to next will be all identifying. We'll all be talking about these themes that we identified initially, right? And each one has a take on it. Each one's an expert in this. Each one has some sort of experience that have been built over years. So it's good to listen and to hear. And included in that is also the religious, because that's also important, because our communities are very religious in that respect.
That's part of the identity.
Part of the
sense
identity.
of belonging.
That's right. It's very close. It's very knitted, right? And it starts at an early age, right? It starts literally from possibly even before you're born, and you're, if you're still, or even as a youngster, it might even start there, right? And typically, as you know, like originally I'm from Lebanon, and a lot of the friends I have here and a lot of the close friends are either from different backgrounds, right? Iraq, Pakistan, India, Canadian, right? And then we have a lot of from the South Asian communities, right? The North African communities. So we have a lot of backgrounds. We think about things differently, but the same in some respects, and then different in other respects. And that difference is where culture creeps in, right? Which is fine by any standards, that we come with different cultures, we come with different backgrounds.
You mentioned at the beginning that the project, this is a phase of part of other phases. So if this were to unfold in an ideal way, what are we trying to accomplish in these podcasts? And then how does it build into these next phases? Where are we going with this, potentially?
Yeah, so what we're trying to achieve at the end is getting these podcasts kind of, have a good outreach, have a good reaction from the community all across Canada, right? And there's our outreach strategy, and that's sort of in play as we're speaking. But part of that is to inform sort of that programming aspect, that practicality. We get all this knowledge out there. Now, what do we do? And the communities will definitely ask, right? So these interventionists, I would call them, right, in the communities, on a daily basis, who deal with the youth, who deal with the families in crisis, and who deal with the families who have even just questions. They don't have to be in crisis, right? Just normal, everyday questions, normal, everyday, possibly trivial matters for some others, right? So we're trying to get the word across to these interventionists that there's a lot of different lenses you can be creative, right? And you can expand your repertoire, your toolbox, right? You don't have to have just one lens, or if you do have one lens, at least polish that and kind of, to make things kind of clear, or focus in perhaps, right? Or maybe it's a training thing, right? So we're trying to move with these podcasts to inform a sort of a practical aspect in terms of programming, and say, okay, if you want to develop a program that gets to this type of issues with these type of youth in that type of setting, you might want to use these best practices, right?
Right.
And then if you, and this is the way to kind of conceive about it, right? And this is the way to kind of implement it in terms of best practices. And this is the way to evaluate, which is, I think, always a missing component in a lot of communities, right? I'll speak to my experience, where I've been here for about, close to 20 years. And that evaluation component has never been there. It's typically you launch a program, the consultation is limited, but there's some sort of launch that happens. It's not as conceived, and there's no sustainability to it, right? That sustainability component, which is important, I feel like it's always missing, right?
Yeah, the self-sustaining.
Yeah, the self-sustaining. How do you end up? There are limited resources, so we have to be kind of fair that if you are limited in resources, what is the best way to kind of leverage other resources for housing? Maybe I don't have to start another school. Maybe I don't have to start a school that has 30 kids. It's a crazy amount of resources to put in a school, and you only have 30 children.
Yeah, the overhead and
it's too much, right? It's unsustainable. And then these things, you notice that they kind of spring up like mushrooms, but then as the season changes, they kind of die off, right? And I think that's something that breaks a lot of the momentum, right? There's a lot of momentum and there's a lot of effort, and it kind of breaks you down, chips at you away bit by bit, right? And that's not, I think we want to try to avoid that, right? We want to try to say, how about there's a more collaboration, right? In terms of getting these things kind of to a more sustainable future to them.
Okay, so let's shift gears here. This project, obviously, as you said, if it's trying to move towards ultimately concrete programming at the end with things in place, this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening with policy backing. And the policy does not happen in a vacuum either. There's a political environment that may or may not inform certain policy directions. So let's begin from there. What are your thoughts on, or how do you read the political environment in which all of this is happening, and then the policy environment that makes it concrete?
Yeah, good question. And Said, I've known you for a long time, right? So, and I'm comfortable to say this with you, and to our listeners as well. I think those who don't work in government don't necessarily understand what government does and how it works. They do understand the larger lines, and the larger lines really come from the politicians, the rhetoric, right, as we say, or the politics. I think once you get a flavor of government, right, once you actually work there, it's a different beast. It's an entirely different world in terms of how it operates, how they put policy, how policy is kind of created, and what are the various factors around it. So a lot of these programs, like even CAMYI, right, coming under the Community Resilience Fund, is under a policy, right, under the policy within Public Safety Canada. But that policy didn't just kind of was created magically. Somebody came with a magic wand and had maybe a unicorn with them and kind of just said, poof, here's something you guys can do. That's not how these things are done, right? And this is at the federal level. These things are typically hashed out over years, priorities, a lot of forces at play, right? So the climate is what I'm getting at. So there's definitely sometimes a political climate to a lot of these things. So these political climate are the driving forces of what shapes the discussion, what shapes the thought, even before policy, right? But policy is not born in a void. It incubates in that environment, in that political climate. And the issue with the political climate is the following for our communities, and even Canada, right? And and even every country in the world, is that there's things you can control, there's things you can influence, and vice versa. There's things you can't control, nor can you influence. It just happens to you. And you're on the receiving end, and you gotta damn well deal with it, right? So I think that's the joy and sort of the sadness at the same time is, driving strong currents that come in there, such as social media, regular traditional. Now we talk about traditional media. Who thought we would talk about that? Traditional media, right? Sort of state actors, non-state actors, NGOs, perhaps all that. Human rights issues that come with these things that are used at a much higher level, right, to drive policy, to drive influence, and to drive control, right? So there's a lot of these things happening sort of up there in the clouds, and you're down there thinking that on the receiving end, you just feel it happen to you, right? And you feel kind of powerless. You might feel sort of, with a lot of question mark in your head, like what's going on? What's the news of the day? So you get two reactions typically. Either you pull out completely and you're kind of unfazed about whatever happens in the world. You lose complete interest, or you kind of buckle up and say, hey, I want to, get out there and do something, or feel like I want to do something, right?
Yeah.
So, the most important probably aspect from this is that, sometimes the climate is limited, right? There's only so many factors and so many issues you can deal with at the same time. So it ends up being funneled, even when that political climate is shaped up, it ends up being funneled, right? And the funneling aspect says, this is what's important, this is what should be focused on, and all the rest kind of do away with it. And you got no control. And sometimes that comes, upstream, right? So, as an example, right, BLM movement across the US that kind of started with the killing of George Floyd, right? So this enforced and this kind of spur this great kind of movement of consciousness, right? Of people saying that, there's something going on here, right? We gotta need to change. There's something structural going on. We can't put our hand on it, right? It's not really visible, but we need to address it somehow. And I think that climate kind of just, a strong torrent of events right around there that pushed its way beyond the borders of the US, right? It went to Canada, went to the whole world. You got protests happening literally everywhere in the main, at least Western countries, right? That are feeling this, that are feeling the impact of this, right? And then the issue gets confounded in the following. So it gets confounded in that climate where you probably sometimes get unempathetic leadership, right? Or sometimes you get an ear, right? But these ears, you got to find them, or you got to work hard to find them. And I think Canada has a good response, right? So I think just being also in government, we've seen it, with the emails that are flying around from the deputy ministers, from Treasury Board, and so on, where they do want to address, they do, I think, see that there is systemic discrimination. That's what they're calling it today, right? Systemic discrimination, systemic bias somehow in the system. And it's not really written, right? So you won't go find today a policy where it says thou shall not hire and thou shall do, right? It's not written like that. But a lot of these policies are in that climate. They happen in that climate. And in that climate gives you that lens where you look at this policy and you interpret it and you kind of look at it, right?
So for these issues, so when we look, for instance, at youth in a Muslim community, and we're trying to deal with how best to make them help them integrate into Canadian society, complex issues. But the nature of these problems is not entirely new, right? There have been, let's say, similar in theme, similar in complexity, where you have these different, even sometimes clashing cultural thinking, even ideological thinking. It has happened in Canada. Canada has dealt with it to a large extent, I would say, maybe with even some lessons learned in some cases, right?
That's correct. So, the issue with discrimination, the issue with polarization, right? The issue with radicalization. Just even the term itself. Being radical, there's nothing wrong with being radical. People have radical ideas all the time. The issue is about the violence part, right? So, there's a lot of fringe thought out there. And today on the internet, we're talking about social media. Today on the internet, you can find any community, right? And you're not so alone anymore, right? So whatever your thought is, you'll find that group that espouses those thoughts, and you don't feel like you're an outcast. So you'll find the herd, as they say.
You're validated. The echo chambers do their thing, and
the echo chambers. You name it, you find it, right? And this is just the internet at large. Part of that is that the targeting of Muslims, right? Muslims are living within this climate, right? So as we said before, that they are like any other communities out there. If you take out the word Muslim or Islam, there's no difference. They face the same challenges. They possibly face the same barriers, maybe a bit different, maybe a bit more, depending if you're first or second generation. And some of these are normal barriers, right? So it's not something that we say that they're abnormal. They're not expected. They're expected. You face a better barriers, a better resistance right in the beginning if you just move to Canada. And that's wherever you come from the world. It doesn't have to be just Muslim, right? But maybe it's like what happens to Muslims is that the climate is definitely charged up against the narrative, against Muslims in general. There's no one person that you're against. You're against an idea, or you're against an identity to some sorts. And this I've seen a few surveys out here where hate crime. They looked at hate crimes back in 2017, right? It's an Ipsos survey. They looked at hate crime and they saw that from for the past 5 years, so from 2012 until 2017-18, the hate crime jumped ridiculous percentage, right? 200% jump in hate crime against Muslims. It's like, how did that?
Why?
Canada didn't have a policy to harass Muslims, right? Canada has policies on the opposite, that you leave people alone in the general sense, right? But that climate has been so charged up from politicians, from the rhetoric, from Trump, who kind of reinvigorated that sort of alt-right type of thinking, right? This fringe type of thinking where now it's okay to say it. He's kind of, he didn't rationalize it. What he did is he used his preconceived biases, right? These preconceived notions that he had, and he amplified them. And he said, this is the problem. Those Mexicans crossing the borders, those rapists, they come to take our woman, or something of that sorts, right? And then people, those with not simple, but those people who don't have time to go do the research to see what in the world is going on, how did we get all of a sudden to this type of thinking, they don't have time, right? People are limited in what they focus on. So, and they believe that these political elites, these political leaders are honest to some extent, right? That they've looked at, through their CIA or their, secret services, they've been feeding them this right information. But we've seen that in governments, we don't necessarily always get the right information, and the politics doesn't always speak to the policy. So the policy could be one thing, and the politics could be charged up for whatever reason. And sometimes it can be as simple as your base. You're speaking to your base. That's all it is. You're speaking to your base.
Yeah.
You want to reinvigorate and recharge up your base. So you come up with these fancy ideas that kind of tap into the nerve of your base, right? So you kind of get either more followers or less and so on, or maybe for political or election purposes, right? So a lot of these things where you're kind of thrown under the bus.
Yeah.
And we've seen it in Canada, right? So Canada is no stranger to that type of politics to some extent, but they kind of try to tame it down and kind of recorrect it and course correct to some extent. But we've seen it here as well, right? So we got to there's a survey that was ran by Ecos Research, right? That's back in 2018. I have it here in front of me. And they were looking at Islamophobia in Canada. And what they've noticed is that your Islamophobia, let's say, is connected to your political party that you belong to. It's crazy talk, right? But it's the reality. It's like if you belong to X party as opposed to X party, you're more likely to support or not even likely to see the problem. I mean, we expect that, but when you see it with data, when you see it with graphs, and you're really taken aback. So when I saw this, I was really taken aback. I'm like thinking, oh my God, it's always been there. And the data's there. It's kind of getting the data and ensuring that it makes a story.
The political affiliation goes that far, right?
Crazy stuff. So is it really that, how do you harbor what you harbor? How do you know what you know? I don't want to get into philosophy, what you know and what you don't know, but, how do you actually know? And how much of it, of the stuff that you know is actually just your own thinking as opposed to kind of being fed to you through social media or through political narratives and so on. And then this comes back to that the political narrative is extremely strong. The politicians have a lot of weight. The rhetoric is incredibly weighty on people, and it does affect what you do. So the downstream effect is extremely strong. As much as we like it, like say, we've lived through universities, we've lived through, our countries as well, where the rhetoric and the politics is the same, and some countries have fared out better than others, right? But the thing that we can say is that as much as nobody likes government to get involved in your life, we like to shrink government as opposed to expand government. That's always been sort of the two sides, right? Shrink or expand, or more or less.
You want maximum freedom, so you want to minimize the intervention, right?
Minimize the intervention. That's what it is. But at the end of the day, it's not, the intervention is not all in the policy, right? It's not just in the policy. Speaking is as powerful as a tool, as powerful as a mechanism to rile up whatever you need to do, right? To kind of be a rabble-rouser, if you want, right? Of sorts. To be a troublemaker, you can use the podium, right? You can use the podium to do a lot of trouble, or you could use it to do a lot of good. And I think Canada has teetered, right? Especially with Trump, right? With Harper, it was a bit different. It wasn't as Trump, but it started a bit with some of that, playing on that Islam and sort of, what you wear, what you don't wear, right? They got into sort of your life of where you should wear it, where you shouldn't wear it. In Quebec as well, you got some of that going. And I think that, charging up the environment and the climate around there just charged up a lot of people politically, right? So the politics kind of got involved in these instances, right? And you can see how it affects. So you may not have a policy around what you don't wear in Ontario, but when you look at the hate crime, most of it actually, the hate crime went up more in Ontario than Quebec. And now you're sitting back, you're like, what the, like WTH, I'm not going to say F, but WTH, right? Moment. You're like, whoa, what's going on? Quebec is having this, but it goes up even more in Ontario. And you can see it's the weight of the
political discourse. And then you can start to see correlations. Because as you said, the government is trying to put in all sorts of programs and measures in place. You should be noticing very clearly an improvement in these things. And then you see things like that. So the only real big change happening is in the political environment, right?
Exactly that. So the policy is kind of the discourse. And so what the climate does, it funnels into the discourse, right? So now when there's something that you need to do in government speak, right, in political speak, what do you do? How do you answer it, and how do you address it? What's the challenge? Is it invisible? Is it, manufactured in some sorts, or is it real, right? And some of this has been, some of the political discourse has been dabbling into that fine line between reality and imaginary, right? There's an imaginary enemy out there. There's a real enemy out there. They're two different things. And sometimes what happens is when you're treading that fine line, right? When you are treading that fine line, you are more likely to, you're not likely to err on the side of, you're more likely to err on the side of caution. But this one works against the communities, right? Because you're saying, well, I just want to be cautious. I want to be extra cautious. I want to put my barricades up, build my walls, and make sure that there's a whole bunch of security things that you would need to kind of encounter before you get into my city, before you get into my circle of
security
sorts.
is supposed to be, it is something of, nothing is more vital. It is absolutely crucial and important. But as you're saying, logically, yes, you would want to err on the side of caution. But what's the danger? You're saying there's a danger that if you go too far, you're going to create another problem.
Yeah. So what ends up happening in that environment is if you push it too far, you get two types of tension. One tension is the policy has to remain. So the policy discourse and the policy development has to abide by law. It has to use a lot of this mambo jumbo in terms of law and in terms of other policies, in terms of harmonization across government, in terms of the constitution, in terms of regulation, you name it, right? Directives and so on, right? So it still has to remain harmonized, but it's not, the interpretation affects the interpretation. The political affects the interpretation of those policies, right? So now we got this policy. It seems like it was done in a good spirit at some time. And then right now you're putting a new political, you're shoving it back into the political climate, putting it in the spotlight. I say, okay, let's take it back and let's say now how to look at this policy, right? How do we interpret this? And how do we go about kind of, does it really address what it's supposed to address? Can we tweak something, right? Can we remove this word, add this word? Can we kind of look at this in a different interpretation? And that's where the courts come in, right? And the whole law is triggered from that. Its courts will come in to interpret and say what's okay, what's not okay. And we've seen this done not just with Muslim and Islamic issues. We've seen this done with any human rights issue, right? All the way back from, the oldest thing is the indigenous people of Canada, right? So, I mean, in that respect, when you're talking about the political discourse and that, as an example to the indigenous file, it goes a long time back. So how is it that, for example, the question is here, how did government evolve in dealing with that file, and how does it actually interpret it over time? The Constitution hasn't changed much, right? So how is it that we get different answers at every different time? And that talks to the political comment. So I'll just use this example, looking back at the indigenous file, and maybe before we get that, just to show you kind of the complexity of government thinking and the way it has evolved. I'll even go further, well, not further, but at least the 70s in Quebec, right? So back in the 70s, so back in the 60s, I would say even farther than that. So back in the 60s, Quebec had two camps of sorts. One camp in Quebec was, let's just say, pro-government, federalist, if you want to call them, for a lack of a better word. And the other camp in Quebec was sort of leaning towards revolution, i.e. violence. It wasn't violence. So here, just to clarify, because I mean, I do live in Ghana, right? So it's not violence in the sense for the sake of violence. You have to understand the climate at that time. So back in the 60s, there's revolutions happening all over. I think the biggest revolution in the 60s is the revolution in Algeria against the French. It was a moment of decolonization. That's what it has to be looked at. So this, if you looked at, 100 years later, you might forget the climate. Okay, well, how did this come to be, right? What's kind of the context? What's the climate? But these movements weren't only in Algeria, and it was also happening in France. A lot of protests in France, protests in the US with the Vietnam issue. And there's a lot of this movement for decolonization and sort of emancipation was happening all over the world. Cuba, for another example, right? So this is kind of the background, and that's key to put that in perspective, because as you're seeing these two camps go about their daily business, so to speak, and then how do they diverge and converge eventually, and how does it kind of resolve kind of let's say, lack of a better word, more peacefully at the end. So what happens is that in that time, there's a lot of bombings happening across Quebec, even in Ottawa here, right? The Department of Defense. There was a lot of support for the FLQ within Quebec. And that feeling of resentment, that feeling of being disempowered, that feeling of self-determination is incredibly strong. It was felt all the way until 1995 for the last referendum, right? So it wasn't gone as soon as you dealt away with the violence, right? It was still there. So what happened in government thinking is the following. They said, okay, there's Camp A, Camp B. People, please try to go to Camp A. Don't choose Camp B. There must be some other way we can resolve this. And it got really bad, I think, with the killing of the minister. I hope I don't get his name wrong. Laporte, right? He's the labor minister for the Quebec government. And there was also the kidnapping of another British diplomat at that time. And I think once they killed him, and then people kind of a bit woke up, a bit shook up, like, oh, that's not kind of what we signed up for, right? That's not
now
what
we're talking about murder and real violence.
Yeah, real violence, real stuff. And this is a high profile. I mean, there was another person killed during one of the bombings. So there's another lady, and she's pure French, right? Her name says it all. And she was killed, I believe, in Ottawa, right, in that D&D bombing. But that didn't rile up sort of the streets against the FLQ as much as that killing of the high-profile minister, and maybe a bit of the kidnapping of the British diplomat as well. I think at that time the French chose wisely. Said, okay, we got to choose, right? Do we go with the youth? It was a youth movement, right? Thousands and thousands of university students were in these protests, right? Do we go this way, or do we go the political way to get what we want? And I think the government, that was also spurred with government intervention, right? So the government suspended habeas corpus. You can be detained for as long as you need to be until we get the truth, sort of the truth out, and ensure that you're not a rabble-rouser of sorts, not a troublemaker in that respect. And that lasted for a few months until they got things under control. And then I think French Canada, or Quebec Canada, took a different approach to this. They said, okay, let's go into the political, into that process. And what the federal government saw at that time, and I'll quote Trudeau Sr., right? Pierre Elliott Trudeau. In his famous speech to activate the War Measures Act, he said the following. He said, violence is often a symptom of deep social unrest. So they knew this, right? They knew there's, deep social unrest, but he relates it to social causes. He doesn't say terrorism for the sake of terrorism, and therefore we're going to get you. He says, no, okay, we are aware that there are social causes. We are aware that there's this divide that's happening. There's this resentment, and there's this, move toward self-determination and so on. But let's do it this way. Let's do it the peaceful way, because violence won't get us anywhere. Yeah. And I think Quebec, from that time, took that political approach, right? So, this in terms, gives you that political climate, gives you sort of that government evolution in thinking in terms of how these things start. And then the October crisis is dealt with through that lens, right? And I think once you notice that there are social causes for this, once you notice that this is not bred in a vacuum, it's not done in some sort of the abyss, right? It's not a black hole of sorts. It's within communities, right? Within French Canadian communities, within Muslim communities, within immigrant communities, minority communities. That marginalization is evident mostly in these communities, right? So the policy development has to come in within that, has to be played around within that climate, right? And the policy development also needs to evolve. Because it's like, okay, I've interpreted it this way. That's not working. Is there another way I can interpret this? Is there another way I can unleash goodness from that policy, as much as it may be skewed or understood even as skewed? And you can see that evolution in government thinking, right after through the Indigenous files, right? So I think that's been where the key, to my understanding at least, the Oka Crisis of 1990, that's been a key moment. I would say that government has evolved in the way it deals with minorities, it deals with self-determination, it deals with these type of issues that are kind of fringy, I would say, to some extent, but then they just that head keeps popping up from time to time. And it's a head with many heads, right?
Mhm.
Because one day it's 1, the next day it's 10, the next day it's 100, and then before you get a whole population with that social unrest that that Trudeau Senior talked about. And I think the 1990, the Oka Crisis, the Aboriginal people at that time were fighting court battles. They're fighting for their land, and they're not being heard. That's really the bottom line. They're not being heard. They went to the Privy Council, they went to the King, they went to the courts. I mean, they pulled on every bureaucratic area and political area possible. But that constant evasion is crazy. They evaded them for so long until the water just overflowed and you can't control, the torrent of water that's coming at you.
Yeah. So how did it evolve?
Yeah. So
What was the click? What was the?
the click was here. So the Oka crisis. So that the municipal. I mean the Oka crisis happened with the Mohawk people, right? And the Mohawk people of Kanesatake, that's precisely where it is. And what happened to them is they were contesting this, not contesting, they claim that this is a 400 square kilometer land, it's ancestral land. Sayed, this doesn't go back 1 year, doesn't go back 20 years. This goes back to the 1700s. Like crazy stuff, right? I mean, who was born at that time to remember this, right? I mean, if you're born in the 80s, forget, let's go to our parents. They're born in the 40s, possibly 50s. Before that, another generation, maybe you remember your grandparents' generation, maybe born in the 18 something, right? You're talking all the way 1700. Nobody remembers who the great grandfather is unless you have a family tree or something. So it goes all the way back there. This has been in the back, it's been being battled in all these different spaces, right? Non-violent spaces, but you're going nowhere and you're getting nowhere. And you're using the policy, you're using the laws, but they're being interpreted against you all the time, at every turn, at every angle. So the Mohawk people said, okay, nobody's listening. What's our last, if every door is being shut, what's your last resort of sorts? Put a barricade, say, this is mine. Too bad. I don't care about your laws. I don't care about this. I don't care about that. It's mine right now. I'm claiming back to it. And, insult to injury is even worse, is that they wanted to build a golf course. You read this back, and this is the Royal Commission came out, in 1996 to see, okay, where did the government go wrong, right? Where did the various levels of government, where did they go wrong? So, and that report is key, right? And shows you that evolution in thinking, right, in government thinking. And the report, I have to quote him for that because it's so important and it's so key in government speak. And even if, the communities, the way they deal with government, that it has to be said. And he said the following. He said that the fundamental prerequisite of government policymaking in relation to Aboriginal people or Indigenous people is the participation of the Aboriginal peoples themselves, and the absence doesn't legitimize government sort of action, right? So they have to be involved in the whole process. So opening the door to them is a means of promoting social harmony. So they tied social harmony. So if you remember, Trudeau Senior said social causes, right? This report 20 years later says, okay, social harmony is not just on its own. It needs doesn't happen in a void. So how about we include them also in the process, right? In the policy process, in the implementation.
They need to be active participants, right?
Exactly that. Active participants, right? Include them in, and that will make a healthier discussion. You'll get to sort of a conclusion that's favorable to all, a win-win situation, as you're also always looking as a lose, but you end up being in a lose-lose at the end, right? Because once you rip somebody off, or the person feels like they're being ripped off, it's not fun, right? It's not fun for all parties. They, as small as a group as you are, you can make life a living hell, and even in a non-violent way, right? Because the Mohawk people didn't espouse violence, right? So that's why I want to make this clear. But they just barricaded and said, okay, this is ours, right? But that, you could see where it might have led if the government had said, okay, no, we want to, each one kind of hunkers down and says, this is mine and not yours. And well, let's duke it out type of thing, right? And
we're no longer in a state of law.
So it could easily have teetered in that path. And I think it was wise on both sides to say, okay, we don't want to escalate, right? Let's go back.
It's escalated enough. Let's de-escalate
let's go back
as quickly as possible. Yes.
Let's go, but that
to the root.
Let's go back and let's include you this time. Oh, okay. Well, that's what we've been asking from the beginning. Oh, lessons learned, right? And lessons learned that should be kind of repeat, it should be kind of reminded of every year that, okay, this is how you include, this is when you're dealing with minority communities, this is the way you deal with them, right?
Yeah. Until today, I mean, these are complex issues. It has not been resolved. The government is still putting funding and energy and programming in place for truth and reconciliation. It's still going on until today. I think huge achievements. There's been a lot of success secured, but there's still a long way to go. But I think that was the key. That was my question, and that was perhaps the key moment to realize that they need to be as much part of this process as we are, as a government is, as the policymakers are, right? And so you're saying basically this needs to become the template and the model to follow when we're dealing with minority situations and communities, including the Muslim community.
Yeah, and really the question for me comes down to, as people in the community, we're involved in the community 24/7, as they say. And sometimes that gets to you. That question comes to you like, okay, what's going on? How come it seems like we're inching, or sometimes we take one step forward and then maybe two steps back?
Yeah.
What's the climate look like? What's that political discourse? Where's the policy? What's the policy? There's a lot of questions, right, that come to you. And a lot of it is participation enough? Are we even participating?
Well, I was going to ask you, are we participating? First, even before the participation, do you feel there is enough awareness? So maybe on the government side, there have been lessons learned. It's questionable whether they have been applied to all the other areas, or the focus is right now on one big file, one complex big file, truth and reconciliation with the indigenous. Perhaps the systemic discrimination is another one right now they're dealing with, but maybe that this has not been generalized to all the other communities dealing with these issues. That's one. So that's from the government side. Then on the community side, is there even enough awareness, do you think, about all of this and the need for this active engagement and participation, as you're saying? And then I'll ask you about, is there enough happening? Before I'm participating, do you feel that the community organizations, members of the communities we're talking about, to what extent are they even aware that this is, a need and you need to move in that direction as a community?
Yeah, so maybe I'll deal with the community because I want to touch base on the community, and then I'll deal with the government component of that, or the other side of the flip of the coin, right? Is that the indigenous? Let me clarify something. So the indigenous file has come a long way. They're not the same as any other minority community. I mean, they are the natives of this country. They're the first peoples that were met by the likes of the forefathers of Columbus and so on, and you name them, right? You go ahead and name all that list, right? So they're the ones who were living here. They're the ones who were hospitable to the people that have the colonizers, let's say, for now, for lack of a better word, at least, or the explorers. They call them explorers, but you pick your term. So I think in that respect, they've come such a long way, and there's always more to do. And the light has always been shown on them, right? I had a professor, his name is Dr. Tonio Sadiq. He used to teach me in University of Ottawa. And in his thesis, PhD thesis, at one time he spoke to us about it. And he said, just the media attention that's given to the indigenous files is always in such a negative light. It's the typical stigma, the typical stereotype that's associated when you're dealing with indigenous issues and so on. The Highway of Sorrows, this is known as a highway in BC. It's a stretch in BC, right? Where 600 indigenous people, girls and women, disappeared. And things didn't move until things kind of went to the brim. Like, what the hell's going on there? Not a WTH moment. Like, what, how did that happen? Are the security establishment, asleep, or like, what's going on type of thing, right? But then you see George Floyd, it's that thing where the policy's there, but the climate and the interpretation is the harder one to kind of, fix from time to time. And I think the communities, coming back to our communities, the Muslim communities, we have a lot to learn from the indigenous, right? We're on the top of the list in terms of hate. We're on the top of the list in terms of discrimination. I think the indigenous and other minority communities come way, way lower. Muslims are the top. But then there's nothing, the strategy from the community is absent. At least what I feel from my experience. And the strategy should be around civic engagement, looking at it through civic engagement, some sort of engagement. That's a strategy, right? It's not a one-time thing. It's not a one envelope where you give money and you say, hey, take that, leave me alone for a few years, and then we'll see if it becomes a priority later on. And that civic engagement is key, because that civic engagement looks at building that symbiotic relationship, that continuous, sustainable relationship between these communities and at all levels of government, whether it's provincial or federal. But the federal, for me, because other than working in the federal government, it has such a big impact, right? I mean, when you think about health, you necessarily don't think about the health ministry within Ontario government, right? Or on the opposite side, and if you're living in Quebec here, right? I mean, you're thinking Health Canada, and that's the impact of government, right? So a lot of these federal, I would say, departments have a lot of have a lot of influence, and sort of they shape the narrative on a lot of things, right? And I think the federal government has a lot to play around here, because Muslim communities are across Canada. It's not all bundled in one area, geographical area. There's some of them are small, some of them are large, big, some of them are sophisticated, more mature, some are less in terms of their work and so on. And the level of education, all this comes to play, right? And the Stats Canada has, just remind me right now, Stats Canada has a lot of reports on this, right? The issue is that, can these communities actually access the, other than access, I mean, anybody can download something. Do they even understand what's being said? Are all these data being kind of, going into a big black hole, feeding the beast type of thing? You just feed the beast and you don't know where this is going, right? And is that data being taken and being put in some context where you're now strategizing? Okay, I have this going on. I see that StatsCan has an immigration, has a look at the democracy index, health in Canada, and so on, and looks at the communities, immigrant communities. Doesn't separate them into where and what, right? And that's fine. It gives you an idea, right? So within that report, they look at, they notice that age, income, education, and your background, all this, all these criteria that they've kind of assessed will determine how engaged you are. So if you have a higher income, you're more engaged. Well, don't forget, our communities are very nascent. They're sort of like a infant at the infant stage, right? They're not mature adults where they're totally engaged, right? So they're already at low income. They're already at low education in terms of Canada. So they could be very educated back home. But when they come here, their education doesn't count, right? So they're working in precarious jobs and so on, right? They already face linguistic barriers anyways, right? They're facing a horde of barriers. On top of that, these different elements determine whether you are engaged or not. And it does. If you're worried about all this time, if you're worried about how you're going to put food on the table, if you're worried about, I'm dealing with identity, I'm not sure. If you're worried with, teenager and kids, if all your worry is about food and economy and not integrated and so on.
Basics,
you're not going to get involved. As a tangent, this is why the basic income speak is kind of being popped up. Hold on, maybe we can get people involved, but they don't have to think about the basics all the time, and we can get that energy pulled out of them in terms of that, in civic engagement. Another discussion for another day. But that's where that conversation has went. So a lot of these stats that are out there where they tell you what's going on, what's happening, but it goes nowhere, right? And the communities are not sufficient in terms of number and weight, and in terms of sort of that engagement is not mature enough to say, okay, we're tracking this. We're taking and collecting that data. We're taking that data, we're compiling it, synthesizing, and now we want to put, let's say, as a lack of a better word, we're going to think about it and maybe get to some sort of strategy. But that strategy shouldn't be built in the void. That symbiotic relationship has to exist between, these communities and government. If it's not there, it's like, they have, I think, an expression in Arabic, even I think in Iraqi, I've heard it a lot, in Iraqi expression, I should say, where if you spit up, it just comes down back on you, right? So you don't want to end up being put in that position where, for a lack of a better expression, you're just throwing up and it comes back down, and you're throwing the ball and it just kind of lands back on you, right? But you want to play ball, you want to make sure that you throw it, somebody's catching it, he's playing back, right? And I think that relationship is a bit absent.
So one of the issues I think is, maybe we haven't called it what it is. We touched about things like radicalization and security, but But I think one of the things that keeps coming up again and again is this the lens from which, and it's not to kind of downplay the importance of security, but the importance that is given to the threat that Muslims may pose in terms of security. And this, how justified is this? How is this reflected in policy plus policy interpretation? And then, obviously, from everything you said, a lot of this is coming from the political discourse. But I think this is leading to a reality for Muslims and the Muslim youth, right?
Exactly that. So, the other question that you rightly pose is, how does this work? How does the government is acting, but how is it actually acting? What is it actually doing? And through what lens are they actually looking at these communities? I mean, I think the most, at least from my experience, and now you can see the lack of engagement, right? Because when you're only one-sided on this, when you're only kind of having a meeting with yourself, it all looks kind of fine and dandy, right? It's only when you sit across and you bring them to participate, that's when you get a fuller picture, right? Mm-hmm. So when there's an absence of the communities at that decision-making table, at that policy table, a definite absence. And I'm not saying this is all government. I'm saying there's a lot of it that happens at the community level as well, right? That absence is also from there. But when the vitality of communities also depends on government strategy, right? So it can't be just kind of like, okay, they're absent, they don't know about the rules, so forget about them. You can't have that policy, and the government doesn't have that policy. But what they look at it is, and the climate. Let me phrase this better. So the climate that they're in is so charged up that when they come to look at your community, it's only a security lens that they use, as opposed to, let's say, a social lens.
Because overwhelmingly in the political environment, that's the lens through which everything is looked at.
If every day you wake up and you hear on the news that a terrorist bombing happened here and there, somebody's out there to try to get you in your sleep, they want to destroy your values and they want to destroy your way of life, well, you're not going to wake up happy. Mm-hmm. Now, whether that's true, it could be imaginary stuff, right? It could be kind of somewhere far off in the lands, right? Even if it's imaginary, it will still impact you, because these people have kids, these people have families, these people live in society. They're not, Canadian officials are not excluded. They don't live in the ether, right? So, they live with us, among us. I mean, you can drive in Ottawa and you can visit many of them, right? We have good relationships with, a lot of the, the MPs and the MPPs. So they're, they live with us, right? But that, that climate that charges things up, when it hits the political elites, they're thinking, okay, I'm going to get a bunch of emails today I'm not ready for from my constituents, from Canadian citizens. What are you doing? Mm-hmm. And that constant nagging pressure, right? With all due right, because the information that trickles down to you is not data, evidence-based. Is not sold to you like that. It's sold to you, as we say in French, as a fait accompli. Mm. The terrorist is waiting right at the door for you. And as soon as you get out, he's about to do something, right? And I think when it's packaged like that and sold like that, it becomes a security concern. Mm-hmm. And when things become a security concern, a lot of things are thrown out of the window. A lot of the policy, a lot of the nice things that you should do are kind of thrown out, and they say, okay, we still have a community that lives here. We'll still have a community that interacts within, with Canadians. They are Canadians. They live among us. So how do we kind of notch it up a bit and kind of tighten those screws around security? So these communities, what ends up happening is they're looked at just through a security lens. So, initially, and I think it's a good time to say this, or at least pass a word on it, when we were dealing with the communities out there in the beginning, whether it was through the initial sit down with these 25 organizations, or whether through the consultation, or even whether through that podcasting, sort of all that prep work that had to go through this, a lot of people felt uncomfortable, with due reason. They're like, why is it through Public Safety Canada? It's a security agent, it's a security department, right? Or it's related to security. And the question is, imagine you're trying to tell people, you're trying to explain, well, this is the political climate, but maybe they don't necessarily, you don't have time for that. You don't have time to try to explain to every single person that, hold on, that's not what it is. That's not what the program is. I tried to do it with some of them, and sometimes I was successful, sometimes I wasn't. But then you tell them, hold on, they told us here's some money. They are concerned with that, but they told us, do what you need, do what you think is proper. And they're not necessarily looking at it through, specifically, let's say, for a lack of a better word, just through extreme security, right? They're not like that. And we sat down with many of them, and they're very nice people. They're humble to the we work in government as well. So, there are colleagues in government, right? But trying to get that message across to your community is extremely hard, because all they hear is the political rhetoric that happens out there in in the clouds, and they're trying to tell you, well, this person said that, and that person said this, and this politician said that, and so how does that mean to what does that mean for this program? Maybe they want to spy on me. Maybe they're out there to get me. Maybe they want to listen in. Maybe that that extra check I got in Serve, I don't know, they're trying to hone in on me right now. Something of that of that nature, some conspiracy, and we're trying to address that and ensure, okay, let's keep the program going, but let's also ensure that we also address that with the government as well. So we kind of heard a lot of that. And, addressing it would be kind of this way to say, okay, it seems like possibly, from at least my limited knowledge, is there's no strategy. There's just a funding pot, and you kind of pick at it if you're successful. Don't mind me even talking about how the proposal works. It's incredibly hard work. And not any community can do it, right? But it comes to that level where you're only looked at through that lens, and there's no strategy associated with it. And I'll give you an example, especially for our listeners who are kind of just tuning in, right? In terms of if there is a strategy, what it might look like. So in government, there's an Official Languages Act, right? I've worked on that before in my early years when I first got into government. And that Official Languages Act, just two clauses in that act, cost millions of dollars, right, for the government to implement, and with good reason, right? I mean, if you're English living in Quebec, and then you're French living outside of Quebec, this is where the vitality comes in. That these communities are disproportionately affected in terms of the barrier, just in the term of language, just language. Okay, it's costing millions of dollars to ensure that the vitality of these communities is in par to the other communities across Canada, and you know who leads this? One department it's a horizontal initiative, a strategy that is ongoing years and years and years, because it's enshrined right into the act, right? And the leader for this is in French, Patrimoine Canadien, or Canadian Heritage in English.
Yeah.
It's a horizontal initiative that touches so many departments, including Health Canada, including the other departments that have to do with that vitality and community component, right? And they lead this across all departments, right? And this is what I'm talking about, the lack of strategy, right? Where you have a funding, grants and contribution pot, and you say, here, have some money. If you don't apply, you don't get it. So too bad, type of thing. But what the strategy does is say, okay, I recognize there's a problem. Not only do I recognize, I've got the evidence at this point. I've got the evidence base and the data to prove that there's definitely a huge problem. If you're topping not the hit list on your AM or your FM radio, you're topping the list of being harassed, and you're topping the list of being discriminated. You're topping the list from all the other communities. You're always topping the list, and excluding the bombings that happen in Quebec and sort of what Muslim women feel, because they're more visible minorities, right? And they're more visibly Muslim.
Yeah, those who wear the hijab, yes.
They're targeted more than the men, right? Because the men, you can't, if you look at me, I look like anyone, and I don't have an accent, and I don't wear traditional, let's say, Islamic or Muslim dress. So, they are sort of under that microscope of sorts, and they're being picked apart left and right. And they're saying, well, how's that even possible, right? That's the question. How is it possible in Canada? And that's, I think, from my, the governments, the provincial governments can do what they want, but the federal can impose a heavy presence and say, you know what? We've seen the data. And if they don't have the data, maybe this is where the symbiotic relationship comes in. Can we sit with you and work with you and get that data and shape it, strategize, and say, okay, let's put something together, right? Because this can only work if we work together. It won't work, the communities on their own. They're too young, not fragile. They're just young, and they don't, it's a lot of barriers out there. Linguistic is just one of them, right?
Yeah, it's like they lack the let's call them, I don't know, the social and bureaucratic maturity required for
that's
right?
probably what most what it is, right? And because they lack that specific language around it, they can't access and what's going on. And there's always these conspiracy theories, and that happens in every community where you don't know what's going on. So if somebody's speaking out there and you're like, what does that mean, right? How do you interpret this? What does that, where do I see myself in the next few years, or does that affect my livelihood? They can't answer these questions because they don't understand that specific language. They might even speak English and French, but they don't understand that language. And so, from that respect, the federal government can say, okay, we recognize there's a problem. Let's strategize together. Let's get you in, let you participate, and let's strategize together. That way, whatever plan you come up with, you say that's sustainable. We can go forward. We can ensure that this goes on for the next 10 years and so on, or the next 5 years in cycles and so on. And let's have it long term, right? Because we're the most vulnerable at this point. We top the chart, so we're the most vulnerable communities across Canada, right? And that may. So there is one thing I'd like to kind of mention here. So there is another crisis of sorts that happened back in 2018. And that crisis included both Phoenix and the Indigenous crisis, right? Again. So these things kind of have been, making their presence kind of always obvious from time to time, right? And what happened, there was a message by the Auditor General, right? Ferguson, may he rest in peace. He's passed away right now. I think he dealt with cancer at that time. So he wanted to link two issues. The question was this: how did we fail in Phoenix? So Phoenix, for our viewers who don't know it, for those who work in government, all know about Phoenix, right? It affected a lot of people across Canada. It's a payroll system. And so the government wanted to update that payroll system, right, from the old one. And the Auditor General realized, okay, we failed at Phoenix somehow. With all the controls, the internal controls in government, we somehow failed with Phoenix, and a big F failure, not a small F failure, right? And he calls them incomprehensible failures. That's what the term he uses, right? And this is right from the message of, so you can see it on the website, right? And then he links that to the Indigenous files. So the Indigenous files, it's more like a departmental crisis. It's not, other than the reconciliation and sort of the school and so on, what happened with Indigenous, he has to review departments cyclically. He realized that, oh my God, okay, I've reviewed Indigenous Services Canada, new department, and they haven't been, they either have not shared data properly, or they've, given a wrong information to the minister, wrong information to Parliament, or not given the data back to the communities. What the H is going on, right? So what the hell is going on here? And linking through these aspects, he had to come up. You might know how, you might figure out the how, where they went wrong, right? But you don't know why they went wrong. Like, why does this keep happening? Why is it that the Indigenous files keeps getting these incomprehensible failures over time? And if Phoenix falls in that incomprehensible failure, such a huge amount of money being spent, a lot of controls in the government, how does something so big, so humongous in terms of resources and money, how does it fail, right? So he comes down to, it boils down to this. He says there's always a tension, a healthy tension, between the politics and the policy within government, right? Between sort of the minister, if you want, and the deputy minister. It's a healthy tension between the public service and the political elites, right? And for good reason. Because the politician comes there, they're elected, right? So the bureaucracy isn't elected. The public service isn't elected. They're there at the will to serve the minister and to kind of support the minister. But the politicians want action. I've campaigned on this. I think this is where I need to go, and this is what I need to kind of put in place. And I want it now, not tomorrow. I want it yesterday, type of thing. They come on that, right? And that's fair, because the deputy minister, their job is to say, okay, this is kind of what's possible, this is kind of what's nice, and this is kind of what's doable, and this is the way we can do it. And typically from that message of the auditor, this is not me, it's not Dani speaking, right? From the message where he says is that there's that tension between action and implementation that happens. And because of that tension, and because you want it yesterday, there's no long-term vision to things. There's only a short-term output type of based vision. What do I get quickly in that money that I can spend? What's visible, right? With social media, what can get me sort of points, and what can get me that election, right? It's very looked at from an, lack of a better word, election lens, right? What can get me points? What can keep me here? And if there's something that's risky, move it away from me. We've heard it, right? If it's too much risk, get it away. Don't let me deal with it. So when you're talking about Phoenix, it's a back office thing, right? It's not important. It's something you just want to do and get rid of, and show that you've saved a bit of money here and there. But when it comes to the indigenous files, it's been that incomprehensible failure.
It's people's lives. Yes.
This is incredible. I mean, with Phoenix, it was people's lives, people's livelihood, but they were able to fix it quite, it's money. Okay, here's some money, here's some checks, have a good day. And then we'll kind of work on it in the background. But with the indigenous files, what's been happening is that it's been, ongoing. Not only that, it's like the same failures that keep just repeat. It's like a bad movie. You know these movies where you keep waking up in the same time every day, and then you get to redo the whole day, and then it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work until somehow you land on it, at the end of the movie. But the movie has a good ending. This one has no good ending at this point, right? Yet, at least. So what's been happening with that issue is that it's been incomprehensible failures not across government, across time, and sometimes the government, poor them, those who are some of them in the political elites, because they inherit this. They come in, they're like, what? We haven't done anything? What? I've missed the reporting. What? We don't have the data? What? You didn't give them the data? Like, what's going on? Type of thing. And sometimes these politicians have to juggle so many files, and it's like, I got a 30-second elevator talk with you. That's about it. And that's the truth, right? That's the environment that they're living in. So they don't want to hear the bad stuff too much, but sometimes it just boils out of proportion, right? It simmers and boils until something pops, and like, oof, now we got to deal with the damn thing, right? And now we got to address the damn thing. And how do we address it? So what's been happening? So this is what the Auditor General Ferguson says at the end of his report, right? He says this: bottom line is that change of in the culture of the federal government, not of the communities, right? Not of the indigenous communities. He's talking here about the federal government, will be the best hope to prevent incomprehensible failures in the future. And he's at least semi-hopeful, at that time. He was semi-hopeful that this might actually repeat itself, and maybe or may not repeat itself at that time. He was leaning towards that it might repeat itself in the next years or 4 years.
Foreseeable future.
Yeah, foreseeable future. So, but culture is incredibly hard. And the way to link this back to our communities is to say, okay, if we're not on the table, if we're not participatory, or if we're not participating in the process, and we cannot build that, we cannot change the culture, they'll always have that lens and a security lens on you, right? There's no dialogue. There's no dialogue. There is no dialogue between these communities. Maybe, for example, NCCM, the National Canadian Council for Muslim Relations, maybe they've been working right now. I've heard that they're working with some ministers on the white nationalist thing, and they're a bit successful on that. And they got a few things that are actually very successful. It's still limited. And then they have to deal with so many files, Quebec and here in Ontario, and I don't know what, the federal. So they're dealing with so many files at the same time. It's not enough, right? And at this point, it's to say, okay, that's why there's a need for a strategy, right? That's why there's a need to look ahead and beyond. And if you want to think about government is a huge Titanic. It's like 10 Titanics, and you ensure that these 10 Titanics or departments are all steering at the same time, and there's a black iceberg. You can't even see the damn thing, right? There's an iceberg at every turn, and you got to ensure that there's enough light shown to say, okay, this is where you might hit if we don't turn at the same time together. We want to turn in harmony, and nobody wants to hit icebergs. And the icebergs is not necessarily violence. The iceberg is just the absence of dialogue, the absence of talking and consulting and strategizing. We're looking for that in order to solve a long-term problem. And part of it could be media, where the community media is not well oiled, for lack of a better word. And so that component is important, because sometimes that community media needs to translate a lot of these damn things back to a specific language so people can understand what's happening. And anyway, there's a lot of things, right? So the way it trickles down to the community and the way it affects us could be in so many different ways depending on your organization, right? But that still has to mean that you have to start the dialogue, and you have to start the dialogue within a framework of a strategy, within a framework that you want to work together hand in hand and ensure that you move forward. Because if you don't get that seesaw effect, I doubt the saw can work properly, right? So that's kind of where I'm heading with this, or the thinking, at least the early thinking behind this. And we see it through the government documents, right? The evolution in government thinking has gotten so good and has gotten so far, And now you have to kind of tie things together, right? So you get the social unrest in the 70s, you get the participation of indigenous peoples in the 90s, and as soon as you hit 17, 18 in that realm, you're saying, oh, okay, we've kind of figured out now. That's not enough to just have this. You have to have this and that. Plus, now the culture has to change. But that culture doesn't change in the void. You need involvement. And if you're shut out from that involvement, or if you're only looked at through one lens, it doesn't allow for a healthy development. It gets skewed. And if your lines of evidence are the media, well, we know how that looks like, right? Good luck. So I mean, it has to have that, it has to have that churning effect, but churning in the right direction, where like lava or magma, kind of folding in on together and kind of getting that information out from that dynamic or that interplay between the communities and the federal government, or other levels of government as appropriate.
So I think we explored enough of the issues and enough of potential solutions and where we need to move. I was going to start, ending it by basically asking you, especially for the youth who are listening in, and who may want to try to do something about all of this and be part of the solution. And I think you started moving us in that direction, the need for engagement and the need for participation and presence and activity. But a lot of what you are saying, it makes me think, when you continue to keep being looked at from that lens, this obsessiveness of looking at you just from the lens of, are you a security threat or not? What would you say to the youth who want to be involved and engaged and participate, but there's kind of a turnoff or a disengagement because of this constant reminder that, really, first, let's see, are you a threat? Before I look at you as a Canadian, before I look at you as a youth who just wants to participate in life, in Canadian life, and so on and so forth, let's look at you as a potential security threat first. So where do we go from here? We have all these youth in the community, and everything that we're talking about, and we're going to be talking about in the other episodes, seems to begin with this point and come back to it. So what's the message? Where do we start, and what do we tell them?
Yeah, and part of that message will have to come down to these communities, right? We'll have to come down to these experts, these interventionists in these communities, because we don't know what these youth. We have an idea, right? We have an idea of what the themes are. We have an idea of what they kind of deal with. If you work in the communities, you might get a better sense of what's going on, right? And sometimes it might be individual, right? It might be individual in terms of the advice that you provide and so on. But there is no one trick pony here. There's no one thing that you could say, oh, do this and you should be fine, right? The light switch that we're looking for is actually, a mixing board. It's not really a light switch, right? It's a whole mixing board, and you got to know what you're doing. You have to have a manual of sorts, right? And that manual comes from the experts. They're the experts to say, okay, I know how to switch. I know how to play with this board, and I know what to turn on and turn off. But sometimes what happens is that board is not talking to the other boards, right? They're all doing independent stuff. And sometimes what you notice is that this, even the community strategy is lacking in terms of collaboration, because it is expensive.
Yeah.
So I can't sit here with all good conscience and say, oh, they're just kind of not doing their job. No, that's not what they are doing a lot of work. That's the reality. But that lots of work requires another additional layer of work, which is collaborative across these organizations, the cross-cutting stuff, right? And for the communities, communities to do that, it's another layer of work, and that cannot happen easily. It's a lot of work, like lots, and you've seen it, right? And I've experienced it just through doing this type of initiative, where we had to put a lot of resources. This is on top of our expertise, on top of our government expertise, and so on, and lenses that we carry with us, and we're able to kind of at least push this through. But a lot of the communities lack that capacity, resources, and possibly to some extent, depending on where you are, what level, the knowledge to push these through. And so, sometimes when the youth are facing these issues, it could be a perception, right? I'll give you an example. And this is where the work and these interventionists have to be kind of cognizant to some extent, at least, that the way they also talk to them and the way they shape the narrative is important, right? Sort of don't feed their biases, recorrect some of these so they can do that work at their level as well. And I'll give you an example. So in my other hat, I wear, I'm the director at the ARC Center of Excellence here in Ottawa. And so we had a program, as an example, right? We had a program that is for career development. And initially, what we thought about this program is to say, okay, there's a lot of our youth that we know that don't have jobs. They're educated, but they don't have jobs. So what's the issue? Is it, the easiest thing that you could say it's racism, discrimination. Does it exist? Yes. But when you can't point your finger on it, you don't want to take that approach because
It's anecdotal. It's not, yeah.
Unless you have something written and somebody told you, hey, get the hell out of here because of your skin color or because of your accent or because you're pregnant. It gets into a lot of trouble right now. And people don't usually do that. They have a lot of criteria why they want to hire. Now you have the best fit. You have to use your judgment, right? So, and this happens not just in every community level. Wherever you're hiring, there's somebody who always has a judgment on something. So this is not to other employers as opposed to the community. It happens at every level. And so sometimes the perception is important because these youth that are coming in, the easiest thing you could use is sort of say, oh, I didn't do this because somebody else did something wrong. And I want to bring this discussion back to each individual person themselves. Say, okay, have I done everything that I could? And have I tapped into the resources out there that could help me?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times you realize that these youth don't tap into resources or the reach is not there. And so what happens when we did our program, for example, we said, okay, we're going to announce this program. Here's what's going to do. This is kind of what we're going to do. We're going to take it from an A to Z approach to get a job. And to some extent, we only not wanted to help them. We wanted to prove a point that we can do a change. We can change people's perception and perspective. And so out of that 20 that we did this year in that sort of that career development, about 12 or 13 got hired. So now it's like, okay, you got 60% or something over that are hired from the pool, right, of the candidates that you work with. So now it's not an issue of just discrimination. There is, but it's not only that. And people have to be fair. Communities have to be fair as well, right? But the government also has to be fair. And you need that both that fairness and sort of these leveling the playing field of some sorts, right? Because I think the barriers that most of these communities face and these youth and individuals on the ground, the opportunity that are there, they're already not in their favor. It's like the deck is kind of stacked against you in some sorts, right? And all these different barriers, plus now you don't have a job, oh God, type of thing, right? So I think for us, getting them involved in the economy of Canada is important, in the local economy or the social economy and so on. That's one key of getting them sort of involved, integrated, mixing and so on, and talking. And it, over time, I think it levels that interaction levels everyone on the same playing field. Oh, I met so and so. Oh, wow, I thought they were this, but now they're like this, right? And that happens both sides, right? So, and individual here might say, oh, I met through work this and this, and oh yeah, I see now. Maybe I had something right and wrong. Maybe I missed the mark, right? There's no talking, right? There's no mixing, and so the absence of that. The absence of the dialogue, because you don't have the environment that's conducive for them to mix, and sometimes they can mix through. You want them to mix through the right environment, not the wrong environments, right? And so to get that better that better dialogue happening between all factions.
I feel like you have so much more to say. I feel like we've said a lot already. I can give you one last chance. If there's anything else that you'd like to close with that maybe you feel we didn't cover, or you wanted to specifically mention regarding the project and hopefully what we're trying to do with it, with these podcasts, and this only being the beginning of perhaps something bigger in the future.
Yeah, so I think, part of that advice, right? Part of the advice for the youth, the first thing I would tell them is get involved. I don't care at what level. I mean, I don't know every youth in Canada. They're in, various communities across Canada. But the first thing is get involved. And sometimes what you notice is that this opens doors. And when I say get involved, volunteering, that's probably the best way you can get involved. Places that you want to work, places that you want to go, aspirations that you have. Volunteer if you don't have the skills yet. Volunteering does miracles. I've seen it in front of my eyes where people volunteer and they get the jobs of their dreams, right? And they interact and they link. So the work, the work in your head of whatever you want to do, because volunteering could be your passion, right, as opposed to your work. But that's key for me. It's like volunteer, get involved, get active. It might be a bit restrictive during COVID, but volunteering can still happen, right? And then the other advice is that don't be afraid to ask. Sometimes what happens is we concoct a lot of, ideas in our head, and we make a lot of narratives, and you have to, in your head, everything somehow always has an answer, and it might not be the right one. And in order to ensure and to validate those answers, you gotta talk wherever you are. Just talk, and know that you may not know the answer. Nobody damn well knows any answer, a lot of answers in this world, right? So we're all there in the same path. We're all human. We're kind of walking in the same, hopefully in the same direction, about seeking that knowledge, seeking those relationships, seeking those networks. And as we go, we mature and we develop. And as we mature, so as you're doing all this, I have to remind the youth that, okay, go back to your community and say, okay, I've been there. I've matured. I've developed. Can I pull others with me at this point? Can I go back and give something? There's a movie that one time I saw and says, give it back type of thing, right? Mm-hmm. Famous line from that movie was, give it back. So how do I give it back to society?
Pay it forward.
Pay it forward, give it back, you name it, right? So you got to give it back. But the danger is don't give it back on your own, because then it doesn't work. To some extent, it doesn't work all the time. You need to give it back through a collaboration. Okay, who's like-minded or not like-minded with me, but we can still work together. We don't necessarily all share the same thoughts and the same, ideological ideological constructs in our head. We're different, and even if you're from the same, if you think totally different, right? Things that shape your ideas and shape your knowledge and what you know and your thought can affect you from any different area and any different vector, right? So pay it forward, or take it back, bring it back to them, and work together. It's the only way. And then the government issue is that this is where the youth need to press on, right? So they need to get involved in other areas of local, perhaps, and then provincial if they can, and then federal. So press on, get the knowledge, learn, get in, get active, and then push on your organizations to say, okay, this is not enough. I need these services. Where are they? And if we're only in a mosque, and some of them do, but not all, right? And the mosque has been the traditional sphere where you just congregate, you do your prayer, you hear maybe a lecture, and then you say goodbye, and then you come on the next month or the next Saturday, and
that's a missed opportunity, right?
It's just a repeat, right? But from that repeat, you want to build on it, and I think that's where a lot of the work needs to happen. Is like, okay, how can the youth push these agendas and speak to their interventionists, speak to their leaders, and say, okay, we want this and this and this. I mean, there's a lot that can be said on this. So, I mean, I will leave it up to the youth to figure that out, because we're not there and involved in every community. And I think, but the opportunities for work are there, right? And the opportunities to kind of move forward and evolve are definitely there.
Well, thank you so much. To me, it's very clear from the identification of the issues all the way to the potential solutions towards which we can all start working and moving in that direction. Government can certainly do, at all levels and all orders of government, can certainly do more, or try or show that they're doing more, because sometimes there's a lot happening and we don't know about it, in terms of creating that two-way space for these engagements to happen. Participation to happen from the communities. The communities, I think, as you've highlighted again and again, if I can summarize it quickly, there's just a need for more organization, more coordination from them, and to give that space to the youth. But the youth need to step up and get engaged and participate and voice their concerns and be part of all of this, right? It's their life.
Exactly that. And, there's no one right way of doing something. So that has to be clear, because I think through our work with the various communities across these 20 years, I think that's always a question I've gotten from a lot of the youth. What do we do? There's no right way. I mean, think of it this way. If you're starting at the bottom, you can only go up. And I think that's an example that you always need to keep with you, sort of, in our cultures, we say, put it in between your, on your forehead, or always think that you're at the bottom and how you can go up, right? And if you're at the bottom already, you can only go up. And there's a lot of opportunity for work. But, I think part of it is pulling on a lot of the expertise. There's a lot of expertise in the community, right? There's a lot of people with knowledge
Mhm.
from different areas. So it's not like we lack that, but pulling on them is the different, is knowing them and pulling on them gets kind of a
And
bit
there's a lot of
complex.
individual initiative, but maybe
Lots.
not a lot of organized and coordinated initiative,
Lots.
right?
And I think that's important to kind of finish on that, because when the government wants to deal with communities, they're like, okay, who's the representative?
Mhm.
And you're like, oof, if you got, too many cooks in the kitchen, well,
Yeah.
who's the actual chef, right? And so they always try to deal through one channel instead of 200 or 300 channels. And so but this one, I think this is where the government can kind of support and say, okay, we know this is an issue. How
Mhm.
can we help them bring them together and through that organization? Or how can we push a funding or something that can help them get that,
Unified voice.
yeah,
Yeah.
unified voice of some sorts on different ways, right? So I think that's always important from the federal government, because that could reach all across Canada, right? And I think this step will build that healthy, symbiotic relationship that we're looking for. We're done being on the receiving end. No, we want to be engaged at this point. And
Mhm.
I think the
Mhm.
Indigenous examples, Indigenous files is a great example to learn. And mind you, I think a lot of these instances when you hear about the Indigenous files or you read about them, or you kind of delve a bit deeper, you notice the minority communities are really that conscience of Canada, right? They're like the beating heart. It's the problem that you got to always solve. It's the one issue where um, it attacks at every level your constitution, your values, and you're like, okay, how do I deal with this now?
Mhm.
How do I deal with such a minority? How do I deal with these minorities that necessarily I didn't account for in the beginning, or now I got to deal with them? So it's like, how flexible can these policies and politics be, where I want to live in harmony and I want to ensure they get their rights? Because in today's democracy, and at least the new democracy, is that you cannot vote, you cannot say it's enough that I got the majority backing this thing,
Mhm.
and say, oh, well, it impacts the minority, but I got the majority, so don't worry. It's not enough anymore. And this doesn't work. Social media breaks down all these things, all these ideas, right? And the backlash is crazy once you go that route. And we've seen it,
Mhm.
right? So, I mean, that's all some food for thought for all, right? And I think that's the best way to kind of end this, is that we want to build that relationship, but we know there's also a work that we have to do at our level. There's also work on the political level and sort of the departments or the federal government, and we're looking for that symbiotic relationship. We're looking to build that dialogue and that relationship over time, and how that looks like, your guess is as good as mine. How that looks like down the road.
Complex, fascinating themes and
Yeah.
topics. Thank you so much for helping us navigate through all of it. I think despite how ambiguous and nebulous it can get, I think we see the relationship between the political and the policy and the reality of the communities, and even for the individual youth to find themselves in there and see how they have a role to play. We all have a role to play in all of this. So for all of this, Dani, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me.